In our first lesson, we will take a look at our MoGraph cloner object. So I will add one, and immediately you will see that pretty much nothing will happen unless you add an object for this cloner to generate from. So you have to feed it with some information. So let's create, let's say, a sphere. I will cut down this radius to, let's say, 20, and I will lower this segment count to 16 since this sphere is too small, and I believe 24 is a bit of a overkill. Now let's make this sphere a child of the cloner object, and you will see immediately a change. I will just change my display setting to guard shading with lines. And here under cloner object, you have a bunch of options. So let's first talk about the obvious ones. And for example, this count will simply create a copies instances, or better term is clones. So let's say 10 clones for the purpose of this demonstration. The second option just below that is an offset, and if you play with this, you will simply offset the complete set of clones, and you will offset it by exactly this amount here. This is the default value for the Y, so 50 centimeters in Y. Now, do notice that you cannot select the clones, you cannot manipulate them directly. The only way to manipulate them is through this cloner and other generators and effectors, as we will see. Also, by putting this sphere under cloner, you don't lose the ability to change the settings. So for example, you can still change this to, let's say, 10 centimeters, and all the clones will reflect that change. So everything stays nice and parametric, so it's really non-linear in its concept and the way it operates. So let's get back to our cloner settings, and I was talking about this offset, and this offset will offset by exactly this value. So let's say that we want our clones to sit exactly on the top of each other. So you would have to take this radius and simply enter the double value here. And I'm sure you understand why double value, because the radius really goes from the center outward, so it goes in all directions. That means from here, let's just doodle that, so from the center to here it's 10 centimeters, and also from the center to here, or any given point on the sphere, is double the size. So sphere is effectively 20 centimeters in diameter. I hope this is understandable. That's a really basic mathematics. So if I put 20 here, my spheres will lie exactly on the top of each other. I did this simply because I believe it will be much easier to understand this mode here. So this offset will offset by exactly this amount. So all this position, scale, and rotation values here means you can modify them on a complete set of clones. So for example, you can move them in the X also, and the changes will propagate through the clone. So let's put this to 0. Now this mode per step, this means that between any of these guys, and it really doesn't matter how many of them, you can see you can stack them as long as you want. You can enter ludicrous values here. So it really doesn't matter how big this number is, the gap between them will be always 20 centimeters. And if you remember correctly, everything in Cina 4D is calculated from the axis. So from the axis of, let's just select this red color. So from the axis of this guy to this guy is 20 centimeters. Also for this guy, and so on and so forth. I hope this is clear enough. And I really know this may sound a little bit boring, but this is really crucial for you to understand. Now, for the sake of easier following, I will put this to count of 10, so we really have a nice round number. So now we instructed the cloner to give us 10 clones in per step mode, and the size of that step is 20 centimeters. If I change this now to a endpoint, Sina4D will calculate all the values combined, and it will give us a value of 180. Now this may seem a little bit confusing because some of you were maybe expected 200 here, but let's just clarify this. If you count the gaps, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so the gaps are relevant, not the initial clone, and that really gives you an exact combined value of 180 centimeters. So in this mode, Sina4D really calculated from here to here, so it calculated 180 centimeters to the end point, as opposed to this per step value. And you see how smart it is. It simply calculated back to 20 centimeters for us. So now we have a step mode from here to here, which is 20 centimeters. I hope this is not too confusing, because maybe you cannot really see the real difference now, but you will be able to see it later. Let me delete this little guy, and this amount is really simple. So simply it will determine the percentage of this value that is set here, or any of these given values. So for example, you can maybe squash them as they progress gradually to the last clone, or simply set any other value you want here. So for example, you can rotate the clones, and the changing of these values will propagate through the clones. So let's set this back to 0. This was 100%. So we will use defaults because it will be much easier to explain things. Now before proceeding to these values here, let me just briefly explain you what this fix clone means. So let's just disable cloner for a second, and we'll move our sphere, let's say 100 centimeters in this direction. So if I uncheck this fix clone, then all the clones that will be generated from the origin of the sphere. If I check the fix clone, then the generator will generate clones from the origin of the cloner. So that is really simple. Now this render instances is pretty much self-explanatory. It will render instances of the clone and will increase the performance in the viewport, but it doesn't work in some constellations within MoGraph. This fixed texture we will explain once we get to ways of texturing clones. So let's just for fun create a material here, and I'll load some color and show you the first and the most simple way to texture clones, and that is to drop a material on the cloner object, and all clones will receive the material. So that is really simple. Now you will assign to these rotations here, which you can see they're controlling the clones. You'll also notice this step settings here, so step mode, size, and rotations. Now this guy really controls the step size in percentage of whatever you have set here. So if you scale this down, the step size will go to 0 if you set this to 0%. So 100% means 100% of these values. Now here these rotations will not influence the clones as these rotations. So for example, these guys now rotate on their individual axis. Here this guy will rotate clones consecutively, so like this. And I hope this explains it better than I can. So in this mode, they'll revolve around their individual axis, and in this mode they will use a cloner origin as their axis. Okay, so you can create really interesting effects and maybe despair this and stuff like that. So you can pretty much feel the possibilities already. So a lot of power is hidden in this cloner object. Now this guy, this step mode, has actually two modes. First one that I showed you is, so let's create some value here, like 4.1. In this first mode, the step mode will change the rotation steadily from clone to clone, as opposed to this second mode, this cumulative, I hope this is pronounced this way, really works in a different manner and will change the rotation between first and the last clone, as opposed to this single value that is from clone to clone. So you can see a difference here. So this creates really more like curved and spiral effects, as opposed to this single value, which creates really a little bit more uniform and more straightened results. So let's set this back to 0. And this pretty much covers this part of the cloner. Now we will take a look at these modes for the cloner itself. So first one, the default one, is linear, and let's first check this radial mode. So you can already see that this creates clones in a radial fashion, so you can pick a count, you can increase the radius, you can choose which plane. So for example, they can lie on XZ, you can undo that, and we have additional parametric settings here, so like a start and end angle, and we have an offset, which is not really representative of how useful offset can be. Here is the variation and the offset seed. Another mode here is a grid array. So it will create a grid of clones based on the settings here. So for example, let's say 5 by 5 by 5. This is the overall size of the grid, and this is the form of the grid, so it can be cubic, spherical, or cylindrical. This fill, if you decrease this value, it will randomly pick out some clones and remove them from the grid. All these modes so far that I have shown you are not really powerful as this object mode, and you will see a bunch of settings will change. Now this object means that you can use any object in Cina 4D that includes parametric object, polygon object, and spline object to put the clones onto, so you can generate the clones on the surface on that object. So let me show you a simple example of that. Let's create maybe a torus object and decrease this ring radius and maybe divide this in half, so we have really a smaller object. And there are basically two ways you can tell this cloner to use an object to clone to. The first one is to drop this guy here, or the second one is to create a cloner as a child of that object, and any way you choose you will get this result. So let's actually use this method, which is much more clear. Now you will see that Cina 4D created clones on the surface of this torus, and actually I will decrease this radius to 5 so you can see this much more clearly, and notice how everything stays parametric and non-linear, so it's non-destructive. That's the power of MoGraph. Here under cloner, the settings here and the options will change based on the object that is inside. So for example, if I create a spline and put it here, then the settings here will change, and I will show you that right after I explain this a little bit. So this is really simple. So here you will choose how those clones will be distributed, so they can be distributed per vertex, per edge, or per polygon center or surface. And here you can actually set the count and they will appear randomly on the surface. You can even create polygon selections and constrain the creation of clones just to selections. Also, there is a volume option here, which will create the clones in the volume of the object. And once again, the old rule that everything is calculated from the axis. So this guy will actually go through the volume because the volume of this sphere is calculated from the axis. So we have some additional settings here. You can choose a volume mode as a surface, so it will put them on a surface, and you really have a creative freedom to create really personalized clone constellations. A lot of power and a lot of flexibility here. This up vector will simply tell clones where to look with their axis, and I will use another example to explain this, which we will use just after this one. So let me get rid of this torus and we will use another object. So let's create a spline object here, and any type of spline is accepted. So let's go with the circle spline, maybe a tad smaller, and let's set it to axis so it lies on the floor, so to speak. So Cloner really accepts pretty much everything you throw at it. So it can accept splines, polygons, parametric objects, and almost anything in Sina for this. So let me show you, if I drop this circle spline here inside, how settings will change. And there is one really important relationship for you to understand, that depending on the object set here, corresponding options will be presented here. So you won't get this type of options if you don't use a spline. So here, when object that will receive clones is a spline, you can also determine a clone count. So let's say 20. You can choose how they will be distributed. So it can be a step of this value set here. It can be even, regardless of the segmentation of the spline, or it can be vertex. So it will distribute itself according to the vertices on the spline. Let's get back to count, and maybe just for sake of explaining some things here, I will drag this sphere out and use a different object. I can even hide it. So let's select something that is not symmetrical in any way, and there is this pyramid object. We will also scale it to same size, so 20, and we will drop it under cloner. Now some settings here will be much more easier to understand. Let's in fact even go to 10 like this. Now let's get back to our cloner object, so I can show you these options that will be much easier with this pyramid object. So currently all these pyramids are, figuratively speaking, looking downwards. So what if you want to change that? That is where this rail option comes in. So let's copy this circle spline and rename it rail like this, and drop it here in the rail slot. So you can see now the clones oriented themselves towards this rail spline. So if you drag this upwards, you will see them orienting in that direction. So you also have some additional options like target and scale. We'll talk about these ones later. Now do note that, for example, if you scale this guy, the clones will really look in that direction. So let's leave it like this, and I'll just hide the rail from the viewport, but clones will stay oriented, let's say, their logical manner. Now let's create some motion on these guys. So let's see if I can drag this a little bit more upwards so we have access to all these settings. So now, if I enable this rate in percentage, I will actually make this clones, once I hit play, to really move according to the percentage here. So let's say 20% of the rate. This is like a speed value, and if I want them to move in another direction, I will set this to negative value. So we have a clockwise movement. Now, based on the settings here, you can define the start point for the clones. Also, you can define the end point for the clones. And if you disable this loop guy, then the clones will not loop, so to speak. So they will not appear again undisrupted. So like this is really a closed looping system, as opposed to this one, which is where clones actually disappear when they reach end of the line, figuratively speaking. Here, of course, you have a variation option, so you will create some sort of a randomness within these clones, and you have a random seed. So as you change this, you change the seeding value, and you will get different results every time. This volume spread, let's actually reset this to default. This volume spread will really spread these clones a little bit more in all directions outwards from the spline center. Now we barely scratched the surface, so let me just say that this smooth rotation value will actually create smoothed transitions between the clones. So if you set this to 0, no rotation will occur, so the clones won't be moving. If you enable this smooth rotation, you can actually stop this. You'll probably notice a slightly different results in how clones are oriented. So let's give it a try. And you can see a minimal difference, and probably this difference will be higher when you will use a different clone constellation or different spline or object or something like that. Now let's get rid of this circle and rail. I will enable the sphere, and you see the cloner won't do anything because it's in the object mode. Let's go back to linear mode, so we will explain this additional clones option. So one would ask, what happens if you drop two objects in the cloner? And that's a really good question. So let's drop that sphere and see what happens. And the result is you will have a repeated sequence of the clone according to a sequence in the object manager. So you will have pyramid, sphere, just like here. So pyramid, sphere, and it will repeat itself for this number of times. So any number you set here. Let's in fact create a third object. So maybe we can even use a cube. Let's use the same size, so 10 by 10 by 10. And let's drop that also in the cloner, and some things will be much easier to understand. So once again, we have pyramid, sphere, cube. So here from the origin of the cloner, pyramid, sphere, cube. Then it repeats itself since we have 3 objects here only. Now just bear with me for a few minutes. I know this may seem a little bit boring, but it's absolutely crucial for you to understand if you want to become proficient in MoGraph. Currently our clones are set to iterate, and that means exactly what I described earlier. That means they will iterate according to a sequence set here in the object manager. We can choose a different type of interpolation for the clones. So let's say random. So it will randomly pick between every single object here. You will also notice that you will get some additional settings. So in iterate mode, you didn't have this random mode. So observe carefully if you get additional settings. So you can change the seed and you can see the results in the viewport, every time I select a different number, it will use that number to derive a random value. This blend mode will give its best to distribute these clones to this clone count set here. So you see it really created 3 pyramids, 3 spheres, and 4 cubes. So just to illustrate this a little bit better, we'll increase this value. So you will see it will give its best to keep that general relationship set here. Okay, so pyramids, spheres, cubes. Let's set this back to 10. And the last mode is a sort mode, and this mode will really not do anything unless we will have some fun with effectors, and that is exactly what we are going to do in our next lesson after we briefly go over this transform tab. So to simplify, this sort mode works best once effectors are used. So let's go back to this transform mode, and now here you can set the uniform rotation values for the clones. For example, you can maybe scale them uniformly, because in this mode you will see that these rotations actually propagate differently through clones. So if you want to set something uniform here, for example, if you want to move this 100 centimeters in certain direction, you will do it here under transform. So this is just like a transform tab for any of these guys here, just as a regular object. As opposed to these settings here, you'll see that if I set this to some value, it will propagate differently through clones. I hope this makes sense. There are some additional settings here. So for example, you can set the color of the clone, but currently it's overridden by this material set to cloner. So just as we said in the intro lesson, we have a cloner, which is now a generator. And we will cover these other generators here. And we created a parametric system, and now if we want additional control, we will use effectors, and every effector you create, if you want it to affect your clone constellation, you will have to load it here from the MoGraph menu and drag it into this effector list of the cloner. This wraps it up for an intro for a cloner object, and we will take a look at the effectors in our next lesson.